The cowboy stepped into the blizzard, carrying her unconscious son, and she still tried to push him away. Snow slammed against the wagon, hard enough to shake the wheels loose, while the little boy's coughing suddenly stopped. The cowboy grabbed him first, wrapping him inside his own coat as the woman's stumbled through knee-deep snow behind them, blood dripping from her frozen hand. Then he looked back at her through the storm and said something that made her stop cold. If stories like this still mean something to you, stay with us tonight. The wind came hard off the Medicine Bow Range before sundown. It swept loose snow across Black Ridge Trail in long white ribbons that hid wagon ruts and blurred the edges of the road. The sky had turned the color of old iron an hour earlier. Folks around Dry Creek Crossing knew what that meant. First winter storm of the season, fast and mean. Beatrice Nolan leaned her shoulder against the side of the wagon and pushed with what strength she had left. One wheel dragged crooked through the snow, hitting frozen stones beneath the drifts. The mule, pulling the load, snorted steam into the air and stumbled once before finding its footing again. Inside the wagon bed, Caleb coughed into a wool blanket so thin it barely held the cold back. The sound cut straight through her. "Easy now," she whispered without turning around. "We're almost down the ridge." That was a lie. She knew it, so did the boy. Her left hand throbbed beneath the strip of torn petticoat wrapped around it. Blood had soaked through the cloth hours ago. Every time she tightened the reins, fresh red spread through the fabric and froze dark against the cold. She kept moving, anyway. The wagon hit another rut. The cracked wheel groaned. Then came the sharp snap of wood. The wagon lurched sideways so hard Beatrice nearly lost her footing. Caleb cried out from inside as supplies shifted violently beneath the canvas cover. "No, no," she breathed. The wheel tilted at a crooked angle, half buried in snow. For a long moment she simply stood there, one hand gripping the wagon frame while the wind tore strands of brown hair loose across her face. Then Caleb coughed again. Worse this time. Beatrice climbed into the wagon and pulled the blanket tighter around him. His cheeks were flushed from cold and fever both. "You awake, sweetheart?" He nodded weakly. "You hear me breathing?" A tiny smile tugged at his mouth. Hard not to. She brushed snow from his forehead. Her fingers trembled before she pulled them away. Down below the ridge, a pair of wagon lanterns appeared through the blowing snow. Beatrice stiffened immediately. A freight wagon climbed slowly toward them, led by two broad draft horses pushing through the drift. A man sat at the reins with a little girl bundled beside him beneath buffalo hides. The wagon slowed when the man spotted the broken wheel. He studied the scene before climbing down, untall, broad shoulders, heavy winter coat dusted white with snow. He moved carefully over the ice instead of rushing forward. That mattered to Beatrice more than he knew. The little girl peeked from the wagon seat, blue scarf wrapped nearly up to her eyes. The man stopped several feet away. "You hurt?" he asked. Beatrice stepped down from her wagon fast enough to block his view of Caleb. "I said we're fine." The wind lifted the loose cloth around her wounded hand. Blood stained through it immediately. The stranger noticed. So did the little girl. "Mister," the child whispered softly. "She's bleeding." Beatrice hid the hand behind her back at once. "I don't need help." The man's eyes rested on her only a second longer, before shifting toward the wagon where Caleb coughed again beneath the blankets. That sound changed something in his face. Not pity, recognition. "Wheels split clean through," he said calmly. "Storm's turning bad. You won't get far tonight. We'll manage." He nodded once like he'd expected that answer. Then he walked back to his wagon without another word. Beatrice let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The little girl whispered something to him. He answered quietly while pulling a folded wool coat from beneath the driver's seat. Then he returned. Beatrice straightened immediately. "Don't you dare help me." Her voice cracked on the last word. The man stopped just short of her reach. Snow gathered along the brim of his hat while the wind pushed hard through the pines behind them. He looked past her toward Caleb again. The boy had started coughing so hard. The wagon shook with it. Without speaking, the stranger stepped sideways instead of toward her. He lifted the coat and placed it gently beside the wagon wheel, where she could reach it herself. No touching, no cornering, no demand for gratitude. Then he looked directly at Caleb and quietly said, "Too late for that, Mom." The little girl climbed halfway down from the freight wagon, carrying a faded quilt nearly bigger than she was. "Mr. Cole said he looks cold," she said shyly. Beatrice stared at her. The child's cheeks were pink from windburn. Blonde curls escaped beneath her knit cap. She held the blanket out with both mittened hands, like offering something precious. Behind her, the man tipped his head once. "Mason Cole," he said. "And that chatterbox, there's Elsie." "Papa," Elsie muttered, embarrassed. For the first time in 2 days, Caleb laughed weakly beneath the blankets. The sound hit Beatrice harder than the wind did. She took the quilt slowly. "Thank you," she said, though the words looked painful, leaving her mouth. Mason didn't smile. He just glanced west where dark clouds rolled over the ridgeline fast now. "You got maybe an hour before this turns ugly. I've seen storms before." Not arguing that. He rubbed one gloved hand across the horse harness. "Just saying this trail buries folks every winter." Silence stretched between them. Beatrice hated how tired she suddenly felt. Hated that the smell of hot coffee drifting from his wagon made her stomach twist with hunger. Hated even more that Caleb kept looking toward the little girl with open curiosity. People always wanted something eventually. Always. The wind sharpened. Snow began falling harder. Mason climbed back onto his wagon seat. "We'll camp lower on the ridge," he said. "About 100 yards ahead." Beatrice frowned. "Why? In case you change your mind after dark." She opened her mouth to refuse again, but he clicked the reins first. The freight wagon rolled slowly forward through the deepening snow. Elsie twisted around once and waved before disappearing into the white. Beatrice stood beside the broken wheel until the lantern glow settled farther down the ridge. Caleb pushed the quilt tighter around himself. "Mama?" "Yes, they seem nice." The word nice nearly broke her heart. She climbed into the wagon beside him and pulled him close against her good shoulder. Farther down the ridge, Mason's fire slowly came alive against the storm. Warm orange light flickered through the growing dark. Safe. Dangerous things often looked safe at first. The snow came harder after sunset. Wind screamed through the pines and rattled the loose wagon canvas until Beatrice thought the whole thing might tear free. Caleb slept in uneasy bursts beside her, coughing every few minutes beneath the quilt Elsie had given him. Beatrice stared toward the distant firelight below the ridge. Mason Cole had left enough distance to spare her pride. That bothered her more than pressure would have. Most men pushed. Most men smiled too long. Most men offered help like they were already deciding what it cost. But the cowboy below the ridge had not once tried to touch her. Not once asked why she traveled alone. Not once asked where Caleb's father was. The storm worsened. Snow drifted against the wagon wheels. The mule stamped nervously. Then Caleb started wheezing in his sleep. Beatrice sat upright instantly. His breathing had turned shallow, tight. Panic rose cold inside her chest. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "Stay with me." She reached for the medicine tin beneath the seat. Empty. She had used the last herbs 2 nights ago. Outside, the wind roared harder. Her eyes drifted once more toward the distant fire below the ridge. Then away again. No, she would not owe another man for saving them. Beatrice pulled on her coat, wrapped Caleb tighter in blankets, and climbed down into the storm. If she could reach the lower pass by morning, maybe there'd be shelter near the creek cabins. Maybe. The wagon groaned behind her as she pulled the mule forward through knee-deep snow. The world had gone nearly white now. She could barely see the lantern hanging from the wagon tongue. Then Caleb coughed once, twice, and suddenly went silent. Beatrice froze. Caleb, no answer. She climbed into the wagon with numb hands and touched his face. Too still, too cold. Fear hit her so hard she nearly dropped beside him. Caleb, baby, wake up. Nothing. Below the ridge, a dog barked once near Mason's campfire. Then came the sound of boots pounding through snow. Caleb. Beatrice shook the boy harder, panic breaking through every wall she had left. Caleb, open your eyes. The wagon canvas suddenly pulled back against the wind. Mason climbed inside, carrying a lantern that threw wild gold light across the narrow space. Snow clung thick to his coat and beard. Behind him, the storm screamed through the pines. He took one look at the boy and reached forward instinctively. Beatrice caught his wrist before he could touch Caleb. For half a second, neither of them moved. Her fingers were freezing cold. His eyes stayed steady on hers. If you want him breathing by morning, Mason said quietly, let me help. Another cough rattled weakly from Caleb's chest. Barely there. Beatrice let go. Mason slid one arm beneath the boy and lifted him carefully against his chest. Caleb looked painfully small, wrapped inside the oversized wool blanket. Elsie stood outside beside the wagon, clutching a lantern with both mittened hands. The light shook from the wind and from fear. Papa, we're heading to the line cabin. That old hunting place. That's right. The little girl nodded seriously and hurried toward the freight wagon. Beatrice climbed down after them, nearly stumbling when her numb legs hit the snow. Mason steadied her elbow once, only once. The moment she regained balance, he let go again. That mattered too. The storm swallowed the trail within minutes. Snow whipped sideways so hard Beatrice could barely keep her eyes open. Mason drove the freight wagon slowly through the trees while Caleb lay beneath blankets beside Elsie, wheezing softly in his sleep. Every few minutes, Mason looked back to check the boy without saying a word. The cabin appeared suddenly through the storm, a low timber structure tucked against a line of dark pines. Half the roof sagged beneath snow, but smoke stains still marked the stone chimney. Mason jumped down first and forced the swollen door open with his shoulder. Cold air and dust rolled out. Inside, he said. The cabin smelled of old cedar, ashes, and trapped winter. Elsie immediately knelt beside the fireplace while Mason dropped wood onto the hearthstones and struck a match. The flame caught slowly at first, then spread through dry pine kindling with sharp little snaps. Warmth crept into the room, inch by inch. Beatrice stood near the doorway, watching Mason lower Caleb carefully onto a narrow bunk beneath folded blankets. The boy's breathing sounded rough, too rough. Mason opened a small tin medicine kit beside the fire. Bottles clinked softly together. You got fever medicine? Beatrice asked. A little. For children. He glanced at her. Raised one already. That shut her up. Mason heated water in a blackened coffee pot, while Elsie removed Caleb's boots with surprising gentleness for such small hands. They're wet clean through, she whispered. I know, little bug. The child carried the boots close to the fire and lined them neatly beside Mason's own. Beatrice watched all of it from across the room, shoulders tight beneath her coat. Nobody should have been this kind without asking questions first. That was not how the world worked. Mason finally looked toward her injured hand. Let me see it. I said I'm fine. You're bleeding through the bandage. That's my concern. He held her gaze another moment, then simply poured hot water into a basin instead of arguing. The quiet of it unsettled her more than anger would have. Caleb stirred weakly on the bunk. Mama, I'm here. Cold. Mason handed her one of the thicker blankets without speaking. She took it after a hesitation. The wool smelled faintly of cedar smoke and winter air. Hours passed beneath the sound of wind clawing against the cabin walls. The fire snapped softly. Elsie eventually fell asleep, curled beside Caleb, with one hand resting on the edge of his blanket, like she was making sure he stayed there. Beatrice sat rigid in a wooden chair nearby, her wounded hand hidden in her lap. Mason crouched beside the hearth, cleaning a hunting knife with slow, careful movements. Lamplight flickered across the worn gold band hanging from a leather cord near his collar. Wedding ring. Still carried, still close. Something about that tightened unexpectedly inside her chest. "You should let me clean that cut," he said at last without looking up. "No, it's infected. I've had worse. Maybe." He folded the cloth carefully beside the knife. "Still ought to clean it." Silence stretched again. Outside, wolves howled somewhere deeper in the timber. Elsie shifted in her sleep but didn't wake. Beatrice stared into the flames until her eyes burned. Finally, slowly, she unwrapped the blood-soaked cloth from her hand. The skin across her palm was swollen, angry red. Mason didn't react outwardly, didn't lecture, didn't wince. He just moved the basin closer. Hold still. His hands were rough from ranch work but careful. The water stung bad enough to pull a sharp breath from her before she could stop it. Mason paused immediately. "Sorry." The word came quiet and honest. Not defensive, not proud, just sorry. Beatrice looked away toward the fire while he cleaned the wound with steady hands. Most men grabbed. Most men treated kindness like ownership. Mason Cole worked like a man repairing something broken during a hard winter. Patient, respectful, focused, nothing more, nothing less. When he finished wrapping the clean bandage around her hand, he sat back enough to give her room again. There. Beatrice flexed her fingers once. The throbbing had eased. "Thank you," she muttered reluctantly. Mason nodded like gratitude embarrassed him a little. Coffee boiled over moments later. Elsie jerked awake instantly. "I wasn't sleeping." "Course you weren't," Mason said dryly. The little girl crawled onto the bunk beside Caleb and tucked the blanket tighter around him. Then she looked toward Beatrice with sleepy blue eyes. "You staying till the storm's gone?" Beatrice opened her mouth automatically. No, that had been the answer for years. Don't stay too long. Don't get comfortable. Don't need people. But Caleb slept easier beside the fire than he had in days, and outside the storm still roared against the mountain. For the first time in a long while, she didn't know what answer to give. The fire popped softly between them. Elsie had already drifted back to sleep beside Caleb, one arm thrown over the blanket, like she meant to guard him from the whole world. Caleb's breathing still sounded rough, but slower now, easier than before. Beatrice watched the rise and fall of her son's chest until her own shoulders loosened a little. "Ain't much of a cabin," Mason said quietly, feeding another split log into the fire. "But the roof mostly holds if the wind stays north. Mostly." One corner of his mouth moved almost into a smile. That's the optimistic version. She should have smiled back. Instead, she pulled her coat tighter and looked toward the shuttered window where snow rattled against the wood, hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. "You always pick up strangers off mountain roads?" she asked. "Not usually." "Then why us?" Mason leaned his forearms across his knees. Firelight threw shadows across the tired lines of his face. He looked older near the flames than he had outside in the snow. "Because I saw a little boy freezing," he said simply. "Not because you're pretty. Not because you owe me. Not because I expect something later. Just the truth. That unsettled her worse than lies." He reached for the coffee pot hanging near the fire and poured into 2 dented tin cups. The smell filled the cabin immediately. Strong coffee. Burned a little too long. Frontier coffee. He held 1 cup toward her. Beatrice hesitated. Then she took it. Their fingers brushed for half a second against the warm tin. Mason pulled his hand back first outside. The wind screamed down through the pines again. Elsie stirred beneath the blankets. "Papa, I'm here, Bug." Roof sounds angry. It's just winter talking. That seemed good enough for her. She closed her eyes again. Beatrice wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat sink slowly into her aching fingers. Her bandaged palm throbbed less now. "You got family in Dry Creek?" Mason asked after a while. The question came careful, not prying. Still, her spine stiffened instantly. No. He nodded once and let the silence settle again. That surprised her too. Most folks asked another question after the first one failed. Where's your husband? Why travel alone? What happened to the boy's father? Mason asked. None of it. The cabin grew quieter as the night deepened. Only the fire remained awake. Beatrice eventually noticed the coat hanging near the door. Heavy brown wool. Snow still melting from the shoulders. A leather cord dangled from one pocket. The gold wedding ring tied there caught the firelight. Her eyes lingered before she could stop herself. Mason noticed. For a second, something guarded passed through his face. My wife's, he said. Beatrice looked away immediately. I wasn't asking. Didn't say you were. Another silence settled between them, softer this time. Finally he added, Sarah died 3 winters back. The words came plain. No drama to them. Just worn truth. Beatrice stared into the fire. I'm sorry. So am I. He said it with the kind of tired honesty only grieving people carried, like the apology wasn't fresh anymore, just permanent. From the bunk came another sharp cough. Both of them moved at once. Caleb curled tighter beneath the blankets, face flushed deep red now. Mason crossed the room first and pressed the back of his hand gently against the boy's forehead. Fever's climbing. Beatrice stood beside him instantly. No, we need to break it. I know what fever looks like. I reckon you do. There was no challenge in his voice. Only agreement. He opened the medicine's tin again, frowning at what remained inside. One small brown bottle, half full at best. Not enough, he muttered. The wind slammed suddenly against the cabin wall, hard enough to shake loose dust from the rafters. Elsie woke with a gasp. Mason crouched beside her immediately. Easy now. The wolves? Too much storm for wolves tonight. She nodded sleepily and leaned against his shoulder. Beatrice watched him tuck the blanket around his daughter, with practiced hands, gentle hands, the kind built from repetition. Not a man pretending to be kind. A man used to caring for somebody. That realization slipped under her guard before she could stop it. Caleb coughed again, worse this time. Then his small body began to shake. Panic flashed hot through her chest. Mason stood immediately. There's an old trapper station 2 miles east, he said. Might still have willow bark or fever tonic left. In this storm? He was already pulling on his coat. You can't even see 10 feet outside. Don't matter. Mason. It was the first time she had said his name. He paused near the door. Beatrice hated the fear rising in her throat. You'll freeze out there. He looked toward Caleb lying pale against the blankets. So might he. The room went still. Elsie tightened both hands around her father's sleeve but said nothing. Like this wasn't the first dangerous thing she'd watched him do. Mason knelt beside her long enough to brush loose curls from her forehead. Keep the fire fed for me, Bug. I can do that. I know you can. Then he looked at Beatrice. Coffee grounds are in the blue tin. More wood stacked outside the back, lean-to if the drift ain't blocked it. You don't have to do this. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. Before she could answer, he opened the cabin door and disappeared into the white storm beyond it. Cold air rushed inside after him. Then the door slammed shut again. For several long seconds, Beatrice just stood there staring at it, listening to the wind, listening for footsteps that were already gone. Beatrice sat rigid beside the fire, with Caleb's blanket clutched tight in both hands. The cabin creaked around them each time the storm slammed against the walls. Snow hissed through cracks near the roof beams and melted slowly down the timber. Elsie fed another stick into the fire, exactly the way Mason had shown her. Small hands, careful movements. He always does this, the little girl said quietly. Beatrice looked over. Does what? Helps people? Elsie shrugged inside her oversized sweater. Even when they say no first. Something about the matter-of-fact way she said. It made Beatrice look away. Caleb stirred beneath the blankets again. His breathing rattled unevenly in his chest. She moved instantly to his side. Baby? His eyes fluttered halfway open before closing again. Too hot now. The fever had climbed fast. Beatrice soaked a cloth in cool water from the basin and pressed it gently against his forehead. Her own bandaged hand ached every time she twisted the rag. Elsie watched, quietly from the hearth. "You got children besides him?" the girl finally asked. "No. You ever been to Dry Creek before?" Beatrice shook her head. "It's small," Elsie explained. "Mrs. Porter at the Mercantile cheats folks on flour prices when winter comes. Papa says she'll answer for it before the Lord someday." Despite herself, Beatrice almost smiled. Almost. Outside, the storm worsened. The cabin door shuddered once beneath a hard gust. Caleb whimpered in his sleep. Then came another sound. Not wind. A horse. Beatrice stood immediately. The door burst inward a second later, under a swirl of snow and freezing air. Mason staggered inside, carrying a canvas satchel under one arm. Ice crusted his coat, nearly white from shoulder to boot. His beard glittered with frozen snow. Elsie jumped up first. "Papa, I'm all right." He didn't sound all right. His voice came rough and tight from cold. Mason shut the door hard behind him and leaned against it a second longer than necessary, before straightening again. Beatrice saw it immediately. His hands were shaking. He crossed to the fire without complaint and pulled 2 small bottles from the satchel. "Willow bark tincture," he said between breaths. "Found some at the old trapper station." He knelt beside Caleb and checked the boy's fever again, still burning. Mason uncorked the bottle carefully. "Need him awake enough to swallow." Beatrice slid onto the bunk and lifted Caleb gently against her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she whispered. "Need you to wake up for Mama." The boy stirred weakly. Mason steadied the cup while Beatrice coaxed the medicine between Caleb's lips little by little. Most of it stayed down, thank God. When it was done, Mason sat back heavily near the fire. Only then did Beatrice notice blood soaking through the knee of his trousers. "You're hurt." He glanced down like he'd forgotten. Caught the rocks near the creek bank. "You fell?" Snow covered a washout. Elsie frowned hard at him. "Papa." "I'm fine, Bug. You say that when you're not." Beatrice stared at the dark stain spreading slowly across his pant leg. He had nearly frozen to death out there for a child he'd known less than a day. No bargaining, no demands afterward. Just gone into the storm because somebody needed help. The realization sat heavy in her chest. Mason eventually peeled off his wet gloves and held his hands near the fire. His fingers were red and raw from cold. Without thinking, Beatrice reached for the coffee pot. "I'll pour," she muttered. Mason looked up slightly surprised. She filled a tin cup and handed it toward him. For a second, he simply stared at it, then at her. "Thank you." The words came soft. Like he understood the coffee wasn't really about coffee. He took the cup carefully. Their fingers touched again. This time, neither pulled away quite as fast. Silence settled through the cabin afterward. Not awkward now, just tired. The storm kept roaring outside while the fire cast warm gold light across the small room. Elsie eventually curled up beside Caleb once more, one hand resting over his blanket. Mason sat near the hearth, rubbing warmth back into his frozen hands. Beatrice noticed the tear along the shoulder seam of his coat where old stitching had started coming loose. Probably been there a while. Probably nobody around to mend it. Much later, after the cabin finally quieted, she found Mason asleep in the chair beside the fire. His head leaned back against rough timber, one boot still half unlaced, exhaustion plain across his face even in sleep. The wedding ring still hung against his chest beneath the open collar of his shirt. Beatrice looked at him a long moment, then quietly reached for her sewing tin. The needle moved carefully beneath the firelight while wind battered the mountain outside. Slow stitches, strong ones. By dawn, Caleb's fever had finally begun to break. And for the first time since crossing into Wyoming territory, Beatrice Nolan fell asleep somewhere that did not feel entirely lonely. She woke to the smell of bacon grease and pine smoke. For one confused second, she forgot where she was. Then she heard Elsie laughing softly near the fire. Morning light slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls in thin silver lines. The storm had weakened some time before dawn. Snow still drifted outside, but the violent wind was gone. Mason stood near the stove heating beans in a black iron skillet. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows despite the cold. The tear Beatrice had stitched during the night sat neatly repaired along his shoulder. He noticed her looking at it. His eyes dropped briefly to the stitching before lifting back to hers. Guess the coat fairy paid a visit. Beatrice pushed herself upright slowly. Couldn't sleep. That was all he said. No teasing, no attempt to corner her gratitude. Caleb sat bundled in blankets beside Elsie near the fire, looking pale but awake. The little girl had arranged smooth river stones in careful rows across the floorboards. "This one's the sheriff," Elsie explained seriously. "And this one stole a pie." Caleb managed a weak grin. The sight hit Beatrice harder than she expected. For 2 days she'd watched fear hollow her boy out inch by inch on that mountain trail. Now there was color returning slowly beneath his freckles. Mason handed her a tin cup of coffee. This time she accepted it without hesitation. He noticed that too. The storm kept them trapped another full day. By afternoon, the cabin had warmed enough for melting snow to drip steadily from the roof edge outside. Mason spent most of the day repairing harness straps near the fire, while Elsie hummed quietly to herself and Caleb dozed beneath blankets. Beatrice found herself watching Mason's hands more than once. Strong hands, steady ones, the kind that fixed broken things because they could not stand leaving them broken. Toward evening, Caleb finally asked for food. Mason looked over immediately. "That's so? Maybe biscuits." "That's a dangerous amount of confidence after fever." Caleb shrugged weakly. "I'm hungry." Mason grinned then, a real grin this time, quick but warm enough to change his whole face. "Bug," he said to Elsie. "Looks like the boy plans on surviving after all." The little girl clapped once like this was excellent news. Later that night, the storm finally cleared enough for stars to appear between the clouds. The next morning, they left the cabin. Snow lay deep across Black Ridge Trail, glittering beneath pale winter sunlight. Mason secured Beatrice's salvaged belongings onto the freight wagon while she stood nearby, holding Caleb's scarf closed against the cold. Her wagon sat half-buried near the ridge. One wheel completely splintered, no fixing it before spring. Beatrice stared at it a long time. Everything she owned fit now into 2 crates, 1 carpet bag, and a small wooden box of papers she kept close enough to touch every few minutes. Mason walked over quietly beside her. "You got somewhere waiting in Dry Creek?" "No." "Then come to Cedar Hollow till road's clear." She stiffened immediately. "We've already taken enough from you." "You ain't taken anything. We stayed in your cabin, ate your food, used your medicine. And my daughter's talked more these past 2 days than she has in a month." His eyes shifted toward Elsie, laughing beside Caleb near the wagon. "Seems fair trade to me." Beatrice looked away first. Dry Creek Crossing appeared near sunset. A handful of weathered buildings sat tucked beside the frozen creek bed, beneath rising smoke and drifting snow. Lanterns glowed warm through saloon windows. Horses stood tied outside the mercantile under blankets crusted with frost. People noticed them immediately. A widowed rancher, returning from the mountains winds with a strange woman and boy in tow, was the kind of thing small towns fed on through long winters. Beatrice felt the stairs before the wagon even rolled past the church. Mason felt them too, didn't seem to care. Cedar Hollow Ranch rested 2 miles west of town, beneath a line of cottonwoods stripped bare for winter. The house itself was plain but solid, white paint weathered thin by Wyoming wind. Smoke curled steady from the chimney. Home. The word slipped through Beatrice's mind before she could stop it. Mason climbed down first and opened the front gate. Elsie jumped from the wagon immediately. "Race you to the porch." Caleb hesitated only half a second before scrambling after her through the snow. Their laughter drifted across the yard. Beatrice stood frozen beside the wagon, watching them. Children should not look that happy somewhere temporary. Mason unloaded supplies beside her in easy silence. Then the front door opened. An older woman wrapped in a dark wool shawl stepped onto the porch carrying a lantern. "Well," she said dryly, "either you finally learned how to court proper or winter's gotten stranger than usual." Mason sighed. "Evening, Mrs. Holloway." The woman's sharp eyes landed gently on Beatrice. Not unkind, just measuring. That was somehow worse. Mrs. Holloway glanced once toward the children chasing each other across the yard, then back toward Mason. "Get these folks inside before they freeze solid," she muttered. "You can explain the scandal after supper." And, for the first time since entering Dry Creek Crossing, Beatrice almost laughed out loud. Maybe that's what home really feels like the first time you find it again. Not perfect, not easy, just warm light spilling through a doorway while somebody waits for you to come inside. If you've ever carried hurt so long that it started feeling safer than trust, then maybe you understand Beatrice a little. Maybe you know what it's like to keep one hand on the door, ready to leave before anyone gets close enough to matter. And maybe you also know how rare it is to meet someone who asks for nothing, except the chance to stand beside you when the storm comes. Out on the frontier, folks survived because somebody shared coffee, split firewood, or stayed awake through the night beside a sick child. Love often started that way too, quietly, in small acts. A blanket handed over without a word. A lantern left burning in the dark. A man willing to walk into a blizzard because somebody else's child needed him. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it sounds like laughter in another room after years of silence. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear what moment touched you most down in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a while longer. There are still more trails ahead. More forgotten people, hard winters, second chances, and the kind of love that keeps a fire burning long after the snow begins to fall.